working very well, so we're going to try a little closer. If that doesn't work, then we'll try some other things. So that is the plan anyway.
12 or 15 different mics scattered around the auditorium.
That is, we are getting close to that point. So with all of that being said, I want to mention one thing, and then we'll get into the class. So Zach posted right before we got here. We're helping Brianna move on Saturday at 9:30 to Dakota Dunes, which if you're unfamiliar, which I think we probably all know where that is, but it's not Sioux City. It's just north of there, thankfully, so you don't have to get into Sioux City and mess with all that garbage. So if you want to help, 9:30 over at the old apartment that they are leaving. And so if you need information, just talk to them. They are here about that. With that being said, if you want to open up your Bible to Proverbs. Oh, yes. Yes. So Chick-fil-A, which, as you know, if you've never been, it's because there's not one here. And there are lots of things in Sioux Falls that make this place a wonderful city to live. One of them is not Chick-fil-A, though, because it is not here, and I don't know why. But there is one in Sioux City, which that makes even less sense than one not being in Sioux Falls, in all honesty. But you can help, and you can get good food. And so 9:30 here in town. So we are in a deluge of Proverbs over the next couple of weeks. So last week we've read Proverbs 1 to 10. Starting today, we're reading 11 through 24, which is the bulk of what Solomon wrote. I almost said Simon, but he did not write this. That's Solomon wrote. And so we're looking at that on Wednesdays, and then over the last 2 Sundays, once in worship for the sermon and once in class, we looked at Proverbs 1 and 2. So we'll not spend a lot of time in Proverbs 1 and 2 tonight. We'll focus in on some of the other things. This coming Sunday, we're going to be in Proverbs 3 for the sermon time. And so we're just in a lot of Proverbs right now, but it can handle the focus from us. And so with all of that being said, I want to give a quick background, and then we'll get into some different questions that I sent out for the study. And so, as I mentioned, Solomon is the writer of a lot of the Proverbs. Once you get past chapter 24, we see some various other authors included in there as well. But one of the things that we read for our reading last week from 1 Kings, I think it was in the 1 Kings text, is Solomon wrote a lot of songs, but he also wrote a lot of Proverbs. 3,000 was the number that was mentioned there. And so this was a style of writing that he enjoyed using and teaching with. And so that's what we're digging into today. Let's see. One of the things I did want to bring up. So when you read Proverbs and you read it that they're written by Solomon, how do we feel about that? What's the struggle sometimes when you read and these are the Proverbs of Solomon? He's really, really, really wise, wiser than we are, obviously. And yet, how do things end? Not very good, right? You got this guy who has this tremendous wisdom, and you read it. I mean, every page is filled with wisdom. And then at the very end, right, you get to his life, and you say, what happened, right? Where did it go? Why are you're claiming all of these wise sayings, you're saying all of these wise things, and then your life speaks a very different story. And that's something that we encounter in our own lives. That's a big obstacle for a lot of Christians sometimes, but especially non-Christians in regards to the gospel, is you've got Christians who aren't living the lifestyle, if you will. They aren't walking in step with Christ, and that diminishes the message itself in the eyes of those who may hear it. But the reality is, when we talk about whether we're talking about Solomon's writings or the gospel itself, whether or not someone adheres to what is said really doesn't make it true or not true. Right? I could be absolutely consistent with a way of life and it be absolutely wrong. Just because I am consistent does not make what I'm saying accurate. At the same time, just because I am being inconsistent with the way I am living does not mean the things that I am preaching are wrong. Now, I am wrong for not living it, right? But when you think about the message of Christ, the message of the gospel, or the Proverbs, any of these things, right? The message is true or it's not true. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing. But our lives do impact it. And so we see with Solomon ultimately does impact his own message, and yet he can still be worth listening to in that regard. And so with all of that being said, let's go ahead and jump into a few questions. I mentioned this one on Sunday, but I'd sent it out, and so we'll talk about it briefly. We open up Proverbs, you read all of these different sayings. The first 9 chapters are really connected together, focused in on wisdom and folly, wisdom and foolishness. How are we meant to understand the Proverbs? How are we meant to take these things?
Chapter 1, verse 7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge.
Now, we're meant to learn from these things, to understand and grow, and ultimately be those who are fearing the Lord. We're meant to learn from these, right? We're meant to gain from them. When we read them, especially when we start this week's reading, it starts in chapter 10, but it goes all the way through a lot of the rest of the book. You have a lot of very short statements. I mean, they're usually a verse, right? It's a positive or a negative, and then the opposite included a lot of times as well. So let's just go over to chapter 10. We'll just pick a random one. All right, Proverbs 10:27. The fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be short. Now, how are we supposed to take that?
Kind of as an in general thing. It's like to say, if you raise up a child in the way he should go, and he's old, he won't depart. Doesn't mean they're all going to be faithful. It means generally that's the way it's going to turn out.
So when we look at the Proverbs, there are Proverbs that, again, I guess it depends on what you think, but in my mind, that fall into kind of some different categories. Some of them are they're blunt, obvious truths. No questions, that's the way it is. But there are others, to what Les brings up, that when you read them, you say, okay, but I know of several instances where that's not the case. And in the one that we just read, right, the years of the wicked will be short. You think, well, I know a lot of wicked people that are like 90. Now, I don't actually know a lot of wicked 90-year-olds, but I bet there are a few, right? I bet there are a few. And you say, well, how does that work, right? I mean, and so you got to say, okay, well, what's actually being conveyed here? Is the point that if you obey God, you're going to live to be as old as you can be, and if you don't, you're going to die early? Well, obviously not. So there's something else that we're meant to take from this. Cindy?
I think to take in account of eternity, we're going to have our life with Him forever, and they're not.
Right, and that's kind of a combination viewpoint of things, where this is a general truth in life, but ultimately, and I think his name was, make sure I get this right here. His name is Jonathan Aiken. He said this about Proverbs: this is generally true now, but will always prove true later. And that kind of fits with what you said there, Zach.
I think I've heard it said like the Proverbs would 100% explain life in a perfect world.
Yeah.
But we're in a fallen world with other variables.
Yeah, you think about the world that we live in, right? And there are lots of different things that affect our lives that really have nothing to do with us, right? I mean, none of us, we all have sinned, but we didn't commit the first sin. We didn't bring sin into the world, though we have committed it. But sin is an issue, whether it's ours or, unfortunately, someone else's, right? And someone else's actions can be just as problematic in our lives as they are in their life or someone else's life. And so we've got our own problems. We've got other people living their lives and the issues that go along with that, and that can affect all kinds of things. And so in a perfect world, this is what would happen, but we don't live there, right? And so, Kim, can you kill this mic for just a second, the short mic? Because I feel like I'm getting a lot of extra sound. Okay, with that being said, I think that makes sense. I don't know why this is being like super loud. Just not use that because it bothers me. All right. Okay. Yes.
I think too, wicked people make some decisions that affect their life. I mean, God-fearing people, if they really are obeying God and trying the best of their ability, make decisions in this life that help them live long. And there's a lot of wicked people that
Right. Yeah, and so to what Gary's saying there is when you live a wicked life, when you choose to walk outside of God's ways, there are earthly consequences to that. Those things do happen where you do have a shorter life. If you get caught up in a lot of things that are sinful, there's a very good chance that you will not have a long life because those have consequences. God designed it that way. With all of that being said, I think one of the other things to keep in mind is even if we say, okay, well, the fear of the Lord prolongs life, but the years of the wicked will be short. We say, okay, that's not, we know that there are righteous people that die young and there are wicked people that live a long life. But generally speaking, this is a true statement, and it's worth living. We say, okay, I want to be righteous. I want to live a righteous life because you know what? It does end up leading to better choices and a better life. And so we keep all of those things in mind as we read Proverbs, and I think it helps us make sense of this. The reason I brought that up, and I mentioned this, I think, Sunday, but if we have the wrong view of Proverbs, then we have parents who think they have ultimately committed some atrocious wrong and that their child is not responsible for their own actions. Or if someone dies young, they must have had some awful, horrible, wicked thing in their life that God is punishing them for. Those are ways that you can take these things if you don't have some of that in mind. Dave?
Something like Ecclesiastes almost balances Proverbs. He said, Ecclesiastes, it's all meaningless, and the rich die and the poor die, and so, there's other areas of Scripture that balance some of the Proverbs as well.
Right, and so when we look at these, right, I mean, these are very strong statements, and if I was writing Proverbs, every proverb would be very long because I would have to try to factor in all of the potential other things that would happen, right? I would say the fear of the Lord prolongs life most of the time, but sometimes the years of the wicked will be short. Occasional. I mean, I would add a whole lot, and by the end of it, you would say, I have no idea what's being talked about here. He's just blunt. I mean, he fills it in quick, and that's kind of how they're meant to be used. Chuck brought up life on earth might be shorter, but eternal life will always be longer than for those of the wicked. And that's ultimately, I think, part of the point with this passage. With all of that being said, as we dig into the Proverbs, I want to ask, what are some of the themes, what are some of the things that were emphasized in these first 10 chapters that jumped out to you? And I mentioned originally, wisdom and folly are ultimately the overarching thoughts within this opening section, and really going forward as well. But those are the two main focuses, and a lot of the other stuff kind of filters into one of those two categories. But you've got the idea of choosing a wise life or choosing a foolish life. What other themes or things jumped out to you, Dave?
Sexual immorality, that kind of folds through those areas.
Yeah, so one of the things, the adulteress is mentioned in chapters 2, 5, 6, and 7. And there's, we went through 10 chapters. That's about half the chapters cover the adulteress in some regard, and you can think about it in a broader spectrum of sexual immorality. But it is essentially the foolish way of life that goes after what is not yours. And over again, there are warnings given about that. And it always ends in the bad way. It always ends very, very negatively if you go down that road. And so there is this life of foolishness, right? Seeking sexual immorality. What other themes jumped out to you? Right. So, and that's the part where we're going to focus in on that pretty heavily on Sunday. But the emphasis right in that section is getting your heart with the things of God stored within it, essentially written on it, and walking in God's way and God working and blessing in that life. And that's one of the things that we see on multiple occasions, the idea of storing up these teachings or writing them on your heart. It's the idea of kind of walking with them wherever you go. It's having them in your life. Going throughout your day, that as you encounter situations, the teachings that we see here, and we would apply this to all of Scripture, they go with us. That we're not simply setting things aside. We don't say, okay, well, here's my faith is being laid down, I'm going to go do this. No, it goes with us everywhere. And so we inscribe those things on our hearts. Yeah, Brianna?
Listening to your parents is a good thing.
Okay, so you've got voices, right, in this section, where you've got voices that are saying, essentially, listen to me, right? And one of those voices is that of the parents, right? It's Solomon speaking to his son, saying, heed the words that I'm giving you. Pay attention to the words of your mother. Keep them, use them, those kinds of things. And so you have that aspect of it. In chapter 1, we see some of that in verses 8 and 9. We talked about that Sunday. Following that, and we see it as well in chapter 4, you've got sections where he's saying, don't listen to those who are evil or those who are seeking to harm others. Don't listen to those who are wicked. And so when we think about life, obviously we don't have the stereotypical, I guess, wicked person walking around trying to tempt us to do evil things or something. But there are voices that kind of cry out for us to do things that are wrong. And then there are those voices that we hear at the same time that speak to us to do right. And we've talked about this before at some point, but there's all of those lessons that we've learned at some point, sometimes very good lessons, sometimes not so good lessons, and there are things that stick with us. And I've mentioned that, I don't remember a whole lot about my childhood. My memory's not very good. It was a good childhood, but I don't remember a whole lot. Specifically, all of these, my dad used to say X, Y, or Z. I don't remember all that. I do remember one, and it was nothing good happens after midnight. And that was preached constantly when I was in high school. And nothing bad ever happened, but I paid attention to that, and I listened. The point that we see here is there are all kinds of voices, right, that are kind of entering into our mind as we walk through life, and the question is, which are we going to listen to? And what Solomon is trying to spell out is the voice of Solomon, the voice of the father, the mother. Listen to that voice. Don't listen to those who are wicked. Don't listen to the adulteress, but listen to the voice of wisdom. Is kind of the overarching emphasis in this opening section. Any other thoughts or things that were emphasized in your mind? All right. Let's go to chapter 3 really quick. I want to mention, I had one passage over here that kind of fits in with some of the things that we've been talking about, and then we'll get into a couple of other things. Verse 21. My son, do not lose sight of these. Keep sound wisdom and discretion, and they will be life for your soul and adornment for your neck. Then you will walk on your way securely, and your foot will not stumble. If you lie down, you will not be afraid, and when you lie down, your sleep will be sweet. Do not be afraid of sudden terror or of the ruin of the wicked when it comes, for the Lord will be your confidence and will keep your foot from being caught. Do not withhold good from those to whom it is due when it is in your power to do it. And so you've got this idea here of pay attention, don't forget these things, one of the things that we brought up. You've got kind of to what Gary brought up earlier about a life of wickedness leads to problems, but a life of righteousness leads to good, and he brings that up here as well. And then he includes things like you're going to sleep better. And again, I think by and large we would all say that's pretty much the truth, right? When you don't have things to feel guilty over, when you don't have things to be worried about that you've done, you do sleep better. There's all kinds of things that are like that when we walk through Proverbs together. I want to mention one more thing, and then I'll open it up to any specific sections or passages that jumped out to you. When you consider, and Brianna kind of brought this up, when you consider who's writing, which is Solomon, and who he's writing to, which is his son, and by extension, everyone, but specifically he says, my son, why choose the topics that he did? Why might he have emphasized the ones he did as opposed to any of the other numbers of ones, Brianna?
Well, I think just the sexual arousal and adultery, I think when his dad did that, so he has a very personal connection and story, and you can personally see the consequences of that. So I think that's why he does hit that so often, going back to that, because, in the Bible, and parents do this all the time, where when they really want to get something, and teachers, they say it over and over.
Right.
And so I think that's what he really wanted his son to, and others, to not have their family go through it, not just the people who go through it, because those who do have an affair, it's not just those two, it's their family members that also have the consequences too.
Yeah, and so when you think about what's happening within Solomon's words, you say, okay, Solomon, you didn't heed your own advice. And there are we could all probably think of people, right, who they know the horror of what they've done. They know how bad it is, and they don't want anybody else to do it. They can't find a way out of it themselves, but they don't want you to be in it either. And maybe that kind of fits with what you're saying there. he knows. Ultimately, he will conclude after his life of all the different things that he did that was not worth it. And even though he didn't live it right, he still realized it wasn't worth it. Why else share some of these things with his son? Why these topics in particular? Yeah, this is stuff that's one of the reasons why Proverbs and then James is oftentimes talked about as the book of Proverbs in the New Testament. It's because they're so practical. Now, we believe that the Bible itself is practical, but there are certain places that just you don't have to try very hard. You don't have to try to come up with, well, what would that be like? Well, it's spelled out very clearly, and so this is very much stuff that he is going to have to use. It's going to be needed, and one of the things, and I think Gary, I don't remember for sure if you brought it up on Sunday. Someone brought it up on Sunday, but one of the things that we understand as we get older is experience is a good teacher, but sometimes it's not the teacher that you want to use, right? There are some lessons that unfortunately, and again, we can all think back to hopefully well back in the past, where we had to learn by experience. And it was not a pleasant experience, but we did gain something from it, and thankfully it didn't cost us too much, right? We learn, don't do this or don't do that, or I should have done this, and it didn't end up ultimately costing us tremendously, and we were able to learn something from it. Dave?
From the financial planning aspect, there's a lot of practicality even in these first 10 chapters about wealth and laziness, and the hand goes out and harvests and stores the future, and your first fruit of wealth, make sure you give it to God, and use wealth, not ill-gotten gain.
Right.
So there's a ton of money verses through the book of Proverbs that brings wisdom to your money use.
Yeah, and so we've got this theme, and that's going to pop back up over and over again. And you think about that thought with, again, this idea of trying to help him see all of this stuff before he has to make those poor decisions and learn through experience, right? With money, that would be one area where you could learn through experience, and it would cost you monetarily, but you might be able to recover. But you think about adultery, you think about some of these other topics, right? That's stuff that if you have to learn that by experience, it's probably too late to really have recovered from in a lot of these situations. So there are some things you don't want to learn by experience, and I think that's part of what, as a parent, or in Solomon's case here, you're trying to teach so that they don't have to do that. Now, the problem is young people are thick-skulled or stubborn, or whatever wording you want to use that makes it sound very insulting, but we are, and I don't say that as we are as in I'm actually young. I know I'm not, but I mean we all were young at some point, and we know. You remember, you can, they said don't do this or do that, and your first thought is I'm going to do it anyway, just to show them that I can do it, right? You can't jump over that, well, I'm going to do it, and then you do it, and unfortunately, the worst thing that can happen for us is we actually prevail. We achieve the thing that we shouldn't have achieved, because then it makes us think that, well, we actually do have all this figured out. But you look at what he says here to his son, and it's trying to help him see this is what you ought to do. Don't go down these roads, because they're not going to end well. I got a few comments here. Sheila said it's easy to be led astray by sex in good times, and that's, again, you think back to that situation of the wicked friends, and that's one of the things that's brought up. That's very important. Chuck said the Proverbs deal with universal issues between people regardless of the generation, and so again we see to what Lisa brought up as well, right? This is just practical, it's applicable, and then Rudy said it's uplifting and it's comforting to read these. It reminds us of what we ought to do, and it gives us very tangible things to do. So with all of that being said, what if any particular passages jumped out to you over the first 10 chapters? Any catch your eye, any cause you to think, or anything along those lines? And I'm trying to remember 10 chapters worth of material is a little bit hard, but Cindy?
I think just the overall, the importance of choosing your friends wisely, and even something for a young person when they're starting out and deciding who's going to be their friend and who isn't. The importance of this person has a history of lying. Is that someone you can trust?
Sure.
And learning those values and the overall theme and the importance of words of the feather flock together. Do you want to be in that deep?
Right, and so again, you think about what we read on Sunday from chapter 1. If you look in chapter 4, and verse 14, it says, "Do not enter the path of the wicked, and do not walk in the way of the evil. Avoid it. Do not go on it. Turn away from it and pass on. For they cannot sleep unless they have done wrong. They have robbed the sleep unless they have made someone stumble. For they eat the bread of wickedness and drink the wine of violence. But the path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know. They do not know over what they stumble." Just one of several things that we'll read related to just the way of evil is, it's not going to end well. It never, ever, ever will end well. Don't go down that road. Don't follow those who are going down that path. Karen?
I find it interesting that this is all kind of directed to their son. And, how do they play into it to the daughter? Do they just assume that the daughter is going to be forthright and self-righteous?
Right. Yeah, I think this is one of those where, as we read it, it's going to apply whichever end of the spectrum you fall on there, as far as male or female. This is going to be applicable, and if you reverse the situation, I think it's still going to be useful in the way we do that. But whether, I don't know, I don't remember for sure how many kids Solomon had. So I don't know what his breakdown was of his family. That should be coming up in what we read. But yeah, there definitely is a unique focus here. And that kind of goes through chapter 9. And then from chapter 10 on, it's kind of this just generic, general instruction from that point forward. Sheila mentioned chapter 4, which we're already there. 5 through 9, it says, "Get wisdom, get insight. Do not forget and do not turn away from the words of my mouth. Do not forsake her, and she will keep you. Love her, and she will guard you. The beginning of wisdom is this: get wisdom, and whatever you get insight. Price her highly, and she will exalt you. She will honor you if you embrace her. She will place on your head a graceful garland. She will bestow on you a beautiful crown." I've mentioned before, I'm not a poet, and I don't do imagery really well, and so I read this, and it's always like, what does that really mean? But when you read it, it's like it makes sense. If you try to think too hard about it like I do, it gets a little confusing. But if you just read it, it makes sense, right? You want wisdom. Treat wisdom well. It will treat you well if you gain wisdom. And you think about if you go over just a few chapters, chapter 8. This kind of fits with one of the things that jumped out to me. Chapter 8, verses 10 and 11 says, "Take my instruction instead of silver, and knowledge rather than choice gold. For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her." How does that thought process regarding wisdom differ from maybe our natural inclination to think about life? Yeah. I mean, the American dream. The most of us would say, well, you want wealth, you want riches, you want all of. I mean, again, you go back to Solomon, right? When God says, "Hey, what do you want? Ask, and I will give it to you." And again, you think about. I mean, you've seen all this stuff, right? Where somebody, they rub the lamp and they get the genie, right? You get 3 things. You can ask for anything you want, right? What do they pick? Well, they pick things that basically make them richer or make them more powerful. I mean, that's the way that we think. But here Solomon says, "For wisdom is better than jewels, and all that you may desire cannot compare with her." And you think, okay, I can desire a whole lot of things, right? He says it doesn't even compare to the value of wisdom. And as we get older, right, I think we understand that. The challenge is understanding that early enough that we don't really mess things up. But when we understand the value of wisdom, we emphasize that. We seek that out in our lives. And that's a theme that's mentioned as well, is the value, the importance of wisdom. Shirley?
In chapter 6, I like his comments on the ant. How this ant is always busy and brings in his food in the summer. And then it goes on to talk about us not being a sluggard.
Right.
And so often that's what happens when you see a lot of people, they just don't want to. They don't want to get out there and work to make a living.
our natural inclination, right? So Shirley mentioned chapter, for those of you that are watching online, mentioned chapter 6 with verses 6 to 11, talks about the ant. Our natural inclination for a lot of people is to try to relax more than we work, right? We would much rather have a relaxing life than a hard-working life. Now, that's not true across the board, but generally we would say, well, I'd rather have a really easy day than a really hard day. But you look at and this is a theme as well. We'll see this multiple times over through the book of Proverbs, is work hard. If you work hard, you'll be taken care of. If you don't work hard, then you're just going to have problems. And again, it's something that we see, I think, pretty regularly in Proverbs, and it's very practical in life. We understand that if you're not going to work, you're probably going to have issues. And if you're a hard worker, you're probably going to be okay in regards to food and things like that because you're working hard, and people appreciate that as employers and things of that nature. And so you look at some of these things, and it's not just, hey, don't be lazy, but he gives you this illustration that kind of paints a picture of the kind of hard worker that we ought to be, those who just go about your business, get it done, take care of things. Londa said, if you have wisdom, you can make the correct decisions, and that's ultimately what a lot of this is about. Sheila said, buying things is easy, learning and searching for wisdom is hard. And that is true as well. Wisdom is available, but you've got to search for it. You've got to seek after it. Any other things? I've got a few more, but any other things jump out, Brianna?
For me, Proverbs 3, trust the Lord, and acknowledge him, clean your path straight. I know with me, there's a time I didn't know the next step. And I think it wasn't just a physical trust in the Lord, although I did at that time, but also just emotional, mental, not blaming him, and also just surrendering to him, because when you do give it to him, he will show you where you're supposed to go, what you're supposed to do. And I think that just really helps, especially young people, because when we're young, we think we know it all, but we really don't.
Right.
And when we surrender that and let God show us that he does know everything, that he does look out for us, we just have that peace and comfort. I think we don't have to figure out every step that he hasn't.
Yeah, so when we think about what's happening in the book of Proverbs, right, it's all about wisdom. It's about gaining wisdom. But it's not just, hey, become a really wise person who has everything figured out. It's become wise, and being wise means trusting God. Being wise means relying on God, as opposed to you are some person who has, mastered the cosmos, and you understand how all of the intricacies of the world have connected together. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about someone who seeks God, and who trusts God, and who lives in step with God. That's the ultimate goal. It's not to be able to be someone who people come to for advice, although that'd be nice to do, but that's not the point, right? It's not just to be wise in that regard, but it's to be wise in the way that you live, and ultimately that requires a complete trust in God, and that's what we're going to talk about Sunday, as opposed to trusting in our own ability to figure things out or handle things. Go over to chapter 3. We've talked about several parts of it. I wanted to mention, we're not going to get to this on Sunday, but I want to mention verses 11 and 12. This is something that's picked up later on in the New Testament. It says, my son, do not despise the Lord's discipline or be weary of his reproof, for the Lord reproves him whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights. And so one of the things that, just as we can read Scripture and get a misconception about how God works from, he doesn't keep his promises, that, he should have given me all these amazing things. One of the things that we have to also remember is God has told us, I'm going to allow some bad things to happen. I'm going to discipline you through some different things. And it's not always that you've done something wrong necessarily, but he is kind of molding us and shaping us. We see that in James. And so when we talk about life, sometimes we think, okay, if things aren't going perfectly, I must have done something wrong. Well, maybe, but maybe not. We don't know. At least typically we don't know in that moment. And so what we find out in places like this, and this is an idea repeated in Hebrews chapter 12, is just because something bad may be happening, don't think God has forsaken you. God is disciplining you the same way that a parent who loves their child will discipline them so that they grow up to be a wise person. You can imagine how foolish we would all be if someone hadn't taken a vested interest in trying to discipline us to go about life in a particular fashion. Let's go on to chapter 5. Got a few minutes left, and then we'll wrap things up. So chapter 5 is one of those sections on the adulteress, on adultery. And I found that when you think about the adulteress, you might think of the adulteress kind of in a broad sense as a lot of just temptation in general. It's specific to sexual immorality, but a lot of it applies to just temptation, to the allure of sin in whatever situation that may be. And so you could almost label the adulteress as foolishness personified, right? Go this way. And you look at things like, look at verse 3. For the lips of a forbidden woman drip honey, and her speech is smoother than oil, but in the end she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. I mean, what better kind of description of sin can you have than that? It drips of honey. It's sweet. It looks appealing, but what always happens in the end? It's always bad. It's always bad. It doesn't go well. And so you look at some of the things in this chapter, and a lot of them I think just kind of, they speak about temptation. They speak about sin. You think about those words there. If you keep going, he says in verse 7, "And now, O sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house." I mean, what's the practicality of that? I mean, how would we phrase that today? Stay away. Yeah, and it's not just, hey, don't go past that house in the neighborhood. That's not the point he's trying to get us to think about, right? Is figure out who in the neighborhood is going to tempt. No, he's not saying that. He's saying, don't go where it is. If you know where it is, don't go down that road. Don't walk near it, because ultimately, what happens?
Step over the line. We thought we could get close enough or strong enough, but we don't.
Right. And this is across the board. You want to be content. What do you have to stop doing? Stop going to all of the places that have all of the things that you constantly want and are miserable that you don't have. Like Shields. Definitely like Shields, especially those places that you can't afford the things that are there. Right? You've got all kinds of things where you say, you know what? Don't go to that place. Don't go around those people. Don't go there, because it's not going to go well. It's going to only lead you into more temptation. Now, to Dave's point, right? The hubris, the pride, the arrogance on our part says what? I can handle it, right? I can get close and not touch. I can get close and I can go look at all of the fishing rods, right, and not buy a single one. But you go enough, and what happens, Zach? They go on sale. They go on sale, and then it's too much, right? You've been tempted too far. The line has been crossed. Right? We all understand, right, the general thought. And I think this is, again, it's not just sexual immorality that this applies to, though it's obviously that. But just in general with temptation and sin. You keep going in 11 through 14. I mentioned this in one of the videos. He says, "At the end of your life you groan when your flesh and body are consumed, and you say, 'How I hated discipline, and my heart despised reproof. I did not listen to the voice of my teachers or incline my ear to my instructors. I am at the brink of utter ruin in the assembled congregation.'" Again, you think about temptation and you think that's a life of regret. That's a life that's looked back on and you say, why? Why didn't I listen? Why didn't I pay attention? And then 22 and 23, I think, are a great way to end this thought. It says, "The iniquities of the wicked ensnare him, and he is held fast in the cords of his sin. He dies for lack of discipline, and because of his great folly, he is led astray." I mean, he kind of takes us right to this broader perspective, where our sins, our iniquities ensnare us. They grab a hold of us, and they don't let go, and ultimately they lead us away from where we ought to be. And so, again, there's just a huge practical nature to the words that are given to us here. And then I'll mention one more, and then if anybody else has any that's kind of jumped out to you since we got on this question, go to chapter 9 real quick. Chapter 9, verses 7 through 9. I mentioned this one in one of the videos this last week as well, but it says, "Whoever corrects a scoffer gets himself abuse, and he who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be wiser still. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning." Now, when we read that, our natural inclination may be to think, okay, who should I be correcting? Right? I'm going to make sure I correct the wise. I want to make sure that whoever I'm correcting, they know they need to fix that or whatever. And we do need to help each other in that way. But I want you to think about it from the other perspective of, who am I going to be when I am corrected? Who am I going to be when someone comes to me and says, "Hey, you need to change this, or you need to do that"? differently? Am I going to be the fool? Am I going to be the wicked one, the scoffer? Am I going to be the one who is the wise man? Listen to that again. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. Teach a righteous man, and he will increase in learning. I mean, what's he telling us there? I mean, if we're trying to be that wise person, what should we take from that? Always seek to learn. And in order to do that, going back to what we talked about from chapter 1 a couple of weeks ago, you got to be willing to listen. You got to go into the situation being willing to listen. Now, what tends to happen when we get rebuked or criticized? What's the natural inclination? We get defensive because how dare you? How dare you say this or that? Or have you noticed your life? I mean, those are the kinds of things that we respond with. And ultimately, and I'll use Shirley because I don't think I can come up with anything that you would do that would mess this up. But if Shirley corrects me, and my thought is, well, you know what Shirley does? You know what? I could be totally right. Shirley could be doing something awful. She could lie all of the time. And if that was the case, then Shirley needs to be corrected. But you know what? Even if she is an outright liar all the time, maybe what she said to me is still right, though. Right? And that's where we have to say, you know what? Maybe the messenger is not the best messenger, but the message might be worth listening to. And only, I think, a wise person is able to do that. That's what we're seeking to be. Dave?
Going back to the message, and that goes back to, the validity, maybe just as a personality issue, there's not a lot of validity to that. You can still listen and think, well, that's what somebody does. But if there's truth to it, if it goes back to God's Word, if there's a standard that we go back to, and we're called back to that message, well, that's where it brings the weight of it. It's not because of my personality, I think you should do this or do that. It's because, what does God do? That's
Right.
all of us need to work towards is, trying to help one another with God.
Right, and that's where, when we do get criticized or rebuked or whatever word that you want to use there, one of the things that we have to be able to do is kind of twofold there, right? It's to what Meg brought up. It's to be willing to learn. That's a part of it, but the other part is, okay, we have to determine what is the right thing. And the only way to really do that is to get back into Scripture and say, what is God? What is God's desire? And then kind of use that as a mirror of sorts, right? To say, okay, well, where am I at? And if we find out to what you brought up, Dave, that, I'm just fine. I see what God is calling, and I'm doing that. And I say that was something somebody else had an opinion about that I don't agree with. And I'm going to continue doing what I'm doing because I think I'm right based on what I read. But otherwise, we might also open it up. We say, you know what? They were right. I didn't have the right attitude, or I didn't have the right focus, or I didn't use the right words in that situation. And we're able to learn and to grow from that. Rudy brought up a wise person will take the advice, and that's the simple nature of it, right? Is if we receive it and we're wise, we'll listen, and if it's good, then we will follow it. Dave?
Isn't there great freedom being Christians that we do not have to be defensive? Because if we're wrong, we change. If we're right, we say, well, this is what the Word says, this is what I'm trying to do. And so really, we don't have to be defensive. We can be very open and listen, and then make decisions and discernment from it.
Yeah, there are so many things about our faith as Christians, so many things that we have that they really are. They're wonderful for us, and that's where, especially in this environment where we meet as God's people and we get together, is ultimately, it's the ability that we should be able to have of not being defensive, of saying, if there is a problem, let's correct it, and let's open up the Bible, and let's talk about it, and let's come to an agreement on what God's Word says, and let's sort through this in the right kind of way. And the benefit, ultimately, that we have is we have a source that we can go to, and it's one source, right? We're not going to everybody's perspective about everything. So what does God say? We listen to that wisdom, that teaching, and we seek to then model ourselves after that. And we covered quite a bit of stuff there. Anything else from the first 10 chapters that you want to hit on before we wrap up?
In chapter 4, the stuff that Sheila brought up, I kind of had highlighted too. And in verse 5 it says, get wisdom. And then in verse 6, don't abandon wisdom. So once you have it, it's kind of up to us to continue to use it, to refer back to it, to not turn our backs on it.
Yeah, so Warren Wiersbe has a commentary on Proverbs, and I was reading that, and he brought up the idea of a path or a way or a road, and that's one of the kinds of ideas that we see. And it makes you think of Jesus' words when he talks in the Sermon on the Mount about the broad road and the narrow road. And one of the things that we gain from that is you're not walking in the middle of the broad road or the narrow road. You're not partly on one road or the other. You're either in one or you're in the other. You're either on the narrow road, walking in the way of God, or you're on the broad road. And we understand that we stumble and we fall short at times, and we repent and we continue forward. But to what you're bringing up, Gary, here is if we are wise, we're not going to forsake wisdom. If we're walking in the way of wisdom, we're not going to forsake it. But if we have forsaken it, we're not jumping around. It's not today I'm going to be wise and tomorrow I'm going to be foolish. If that is our life, then we're actually foolish. We're not wise at all. Right? I mean, you're on one road or you're on the other road. And that's something we have to remind ourselves of to what you're bringing up here. Don't forsake wisdom, because the alternative is not wisdom. It's foolishness, right? It's not just a bland, well, nothing. No, it's foolishness is the alternative road for us to take. And we don't get to hop back and forth. We're either wise or we are foolish. Now, we can switch, obviously. You can lose it, but it's not a thing where we just pick it up and drop it. If we are wise, we continue in the right kind of ways, doing things God's way. So over the next week, we started today in chapter 11 and 12, and we'll go all the way through chapter 24. What we're reading is most of it is going to be not as connected as what we've read over the last week. So you're not going to have the flow quite the same way. And so it's going to be more topical. Sometimes you'll notice some connections, but a lot of times you'll think, well, we just talked about money here, and now we're talking about hard work, and then we're talking about, and you can see some connections, but it also doesn't obviously connect. So just as we go through, just keep that in mind. There's not always an obvious connection, but it's all wisdom, and it's all good for us to take in and to think about. And so with that being said, Kim, if you want to cut the stream, appreciate everybody joining us online that did that tonight. We will have a time of prayer request, and we will pray and wrap things up.